Lorena Vale stood barefoot on cold marble, while her own father counted the gold that had just been paid for her. She was 23 years old, and she had never once in her life been called beautiful, clever, or worthy. She had only ever been called one word, whispered behind closed doors and shouted across dinner tables. Barren, a wolf that never woke, a womb that would never fill, a daughter who existed only to be married off cheaply or sold off quietly, whichever came first. Tonight, it was the second one. A nobleman from the north dropped a leather pouch onto the long oak table, and the coins inside it rang out like a verdict. Lorena's stepmother, Deborah, smiled the way a woman smiles when a debt has finally been paid. Her father, Eldon, would not look at her. Her half-sister, Leona, stood near the fire with her arms folded and a satisfaction in her eyes that she did not bother to hide. "She is barren," the nobleman said, as if Lorena were a mare being sold at auction. "But she is young, and she is healthy enough to serve." No one in that hall corrected him. No one defended her. The fire in the hearth cracked and spat, and somewhere outside, a wolf howled at a moon that had never once called to anything inside her. Lorena had been poisoned for years without knowing it. She had been examined, tested, shamed, and discarded by her own blood, and she still did not know the truth that would change the fate of 2 kingdoms. In 6 days, the family that sold her as worthless would learn that they had sold away the mother of the next Alpha King. This is her story. The great hall of House Vale had once been beautiful. Lorena could remember it from childhood, before her mother died, before Deborah arrived with her perfume and her sharp smile, before the healers started coming twice a year with their bitter tonics and their disappointed faces. Now the tapestries were faded, the silver was sold piece by piece, and the Vale name carried more debt than honor. Her father had gambled away 2 harvests. Her stepmother had spent the rest on dresses that no longer fit a house, with no coin left to spend. Lorena had grown up inside that decline, the way a flower grows inside a crumbling wall, surviving on whatever light reached through the cracks. She remembered the healers most clearly. They came when she turned 12, and again at 15, and again at 18, each time placing cold hands against her stomach and shaking their heads with the same rehearsed sorrow. "Her wolf has not woken," they would tell Eldon. "It may never wake. There is no life inside this one." She used to cry after those visits. By the time she turned 20, she had stopped. A person can only break in the same place so many times before the place stops feeling like breaking and starts feeling like simply being. She did not know, not yet, that the healers had been lying to her for years. She did not know that a slow and bitter root, ground fine and slipped into her morning tea, had been silencing her wolf since she was a child. She only knew the result. Barren, wolfless, worthless to a kingdom that measured a daughter's value by the heirs she could give a husband. On the night her family sold her, Lorena had been summoned to the hall without explanation. She arrived in her plainest dress, the one with the mended sleeve, because no one had told her she should dress for anything else. When she saw the stranger standing near the hearth, broad-shouldered and cloaked in black fur, she understood before a single word was spoken. "Father," she said quietly, "what is happening?" Eldon did not answer. It was Deborah who stepped forward, her voice smooth as oil over water. "You have always wanted to be useful, Lorena. Tonight, you finally will be." The man near the fire studied her the way a buyer studies livestock, and Lorena felt her stomach fold in on itself. She had spent years preparing for the shame of being unwanted. She had never prepared for the shame of being sold. "She is barren," the nobleman repeated to the room, as though the fact alone justified everything that followed. "But she is still young enough to serve a household. My lord will find some use for her." Lorena's eyes went to her father, searching for the smallest flicker of regret. She found none. Eldon Vale stared at the table, at the gold, at anything that was not his daughter's face. "You sold me," she said. Her voice did not shake, though her hands did. "I am your daughter, and you sold me like grain. You were never going to give this family an heir," Deborah said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "We needed the coin more than we needed you." Leona said nothing at all. She did not need to. Her silence had always spoken loudly enough. The nobleman gestured, and two guards in unfamiliar livery stepped forward to take Lorena by the arms. She did not fight them. There was no point fighting a decision that had already been made by everyone except her. As they led her out into the courtyard, the cold night air struck her face, and for one terrible moment she thought of her mother, who had died when Lorena was 9, who had been the last person to call her beloved instead of Barren. She wondered what her mother would think, watching her daughter carried off in a cart like cargo, sold to settle a debt she had never created. The cart rattled over the frozen road for 3 days. Lorena did not speak to the guards, and they did not speak to her. She watched the trees blur past, bare and black against a colorless sky, and she told herself the same thing she had told herself every night for years. Whatever happens next cannot be worse than what has already happened. I have already lost everything a daughter is supposed to have. There is nothing left in me for anyone to take. She did not yet know how wrong she was. There was something left in her, something ancient, something sleeping, something that had been silenced on purpose by people who feared what it would become if it ever woke. On the 3rd night, the cart passed beneath a great stone archway, carved with the image of a snarling wolf, and the guards finally spoke. "We have arrived," one of them said. "Castle Draven." Lorena had heard the name before, the way one hears the name of a storm that has not yet reached the coast. Lucien Draven, the Alpha King of the North, a man so feared that even her father, a man afraid of very little besides poverty, had gone pale when the nobleman first mentioned the buyer's name. She stepped down from the cart into a courtyard lit by torches that bent sideways in a wind that smelled of pine and snow, and she lifted her chin, because if she was going to be afraid, she had decided long ago that she would at least be afraid with her shoulders straight. The doors of Castle Draven opened before Lorena reached them, pulled wide by servants who did not look at her the way the guards in her father's hall had looked at her. There was no smugness in their eyes. There was, if anything, a kind of careful pity. Lucien Draven stood at the center of the entrance hall, and Lorena understood immediately why grown men spoke his name in lowered voices. He was tall in the way mountains are tall, not simply in height, but in presence, as though the room itself had rearranged its weight around him. His hair was pale as frost, his eyes the gray of a sky before snow, and a black wolf fur cloak settled across his shoulders, like something that had chosen him rather than been worn by him. She had expected cruelty. She had braced for it the entire journey, building walls in her mind brick by brick, so that whatever waited for her here could not reach the parts of her that still mattered. Lucien did not look at her the way the nobleman had. He did not look at her the way a man looks at property. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been searching for without knowing its name. "Leave the gold count out of this room," he said to the steward beside him, his voice low and even. "I did not buy a debt. I bought a woman's freedom from one." Lorena's breath caught. She had not expected kindness, and kindness, when it comes after long cruelty, can feel almost like another kind of danger. "My lord," she said carefully, "I do not understand." "You do not need to understand tonight," Lucien answered. "Tonight you need warmth, food, and a door that locks from the inside, not the outside. Everything else can wait until you trust that I mean what I say." He turned to a woman waiting near the staircase, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, dressed in the deep green robes of a royal healer. "Mabel will see to your comfort. No one in this castle will touch you, question you, or trade you. You are not for sale here. You were never for sale here. The gold paid your father's debt. It did not purchase you." It was the strangest sentence Lorena had ever heard spoken about herself, and she did not yet have the strength to believe it. Mabel led her up a winding stone staircase to a chamber with a fire already lit, a basin of warm water, and a wardrobe stocked with clothing far finer than anything Lorena had owned since her mother's death. The healer's hands were gentle as she examined the rope marks on Lorena's wrists from the journey, gentle in a way that made Lorena's throat tighten with an emotion she refused to name. "You flinch when I touch your shoulder," Mabel observed quietly, "but not when I touch your wrist. Someone has hurt you there before." Lorena said nothing. There were some truths too old and too tangled to explain to a stranger on the first night. "You do not have to tell me," Mabel said. "But know this. In this castle, your silence will never be mistaken for consent, and your fear will never be used against you." That night, Lorena lay in a bed, softer than any she had known, beneath blankets that smelled of cedar instead of damp stone, and she could not sleep. Not because she was afraid, though some fear remained, but because she did not know what to do with a kindness she had not paid for and had not earned. She rose near midnight and wrapped herself in a shawl, drawn by restlessness to the narrow window overlooking the courtyard. Below, in the torchlight, she saw Lucien Draven standing alone, his face turned up toward the moon, his expression unreadable. He did not look like a king surveying his kingdom. He looked like a man carrying a weight he had carried for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. As if he sensed her watching, he turned. Their eyes met across the distance, and neither looked away first. There was no hunger in his gaze, not yet, only a strange and careful recognition, as though he were reading the first line of a story he had been waiting his whole life to begin. The next morning, a servant brought a tray of food to her chamber, along with warm clothing, folded with more care than Lorena's own stepmother had ever shown her belongings. When she finally ventured into the corridor, she found Lucien waiting near the stairs, as if he had simply known she would come. "You did not have to wait for me," she said. "I wanted to," he answered simply. "There is a difference between duty and desire, and I find I have very little of the first where you are concerned." Lorena's cheeks warmed despite herself. "You bought me 6 days ago for a sum I do not understand, and now you speak to me as though we have known each other for years." "I did not buy you," Lucien said again, with the patience of a man repeating a truth he intended to repeat as many times as it took. "I bought your freedom from a family that had already decided your worth before you were born. What you do with that freedom is entirely your own." He offered his arm, not as a command but as an invitation, and after a long moment, Lorena accepted it. "No woman bought by my gold," he said quietly, as they walked, "will ever be owned by it. I give you my word on that, and my word is the only currency I have never spent carelessly." It was the first time in years that Lorena Vale believed something a man told her, without first searching his face for the lie underneath it. Days inside Castle Draven moved differently than days inside House Vale. There, time had felt like punishment, each hour a slow march toward another disappointment. Here, Lorena found herself waking before the servants came to check on her, simply because she wanted to see the way morning light fell across the mountains outside her window. She did not trust the feeling. She had been taught, by years of careful cruelty, that comfort was usually a setup for a larger fall. So she watched everyone, even Lucien, even Mabel, waiting for the moment the mask would slip and reveal the cruelty underneath. It never came. On the 4th day, Lucien found her in the castle's small library, running her fingers along the spines of books she had never been permitted to read in her father's house. He did not interrupt her. He simply stood in the doorway, watching her the way a man watches something rare crossing through unfamiliar light. "You read," he said eventually. "I taught myself," she answered, not looking up. "My stepmother believed reading made daughters difficult to marry off. I read anyway, when no one was watching. I am watching now," he said, "and I find I do not agree with your stepmother." Lorena turned to face him fully, for the first time that day, and something in his expression made her breath catch. He was looking at the collar of her dress, at the place where the fabric met her collarbone, with an intensity that bordered on disbelief. "What is it?" she asked. "May I see your shoulder?" he asked, and there was nothing improper in the question, only urgency carefully restrained. "There is a mark there. I believe I know what it means, but I must be certain." Lorena hesitated only a moment before pulling the edge of her collar aside, revealing a faint silver birthmark just below her collarbone, shaped like a crescent moon, split by a single jagged line. She had carried it since birth. No healer in House Vale had ever once mentioned it, though surely they must have seen it during their endless examinations. Lucien went very still. "Years ago," he said slowly, "an oracle came to this castle and told me a story I did not want to believe. She said the White Luna, the woman who would end the curse on my bloodline, would arrive not as a princess or a chosen bride, but as a woman discarded by her own family, sold for gold beneath a dying moon. You think I am her," Lorena said, and the words felt absurd in her own mouth. "I am the woman my family sold as Barren. I am not anyone's prophecy. I am simply unwanted. You are the woman an oracle described before either of us was born," Lucien said quietly. "Those are not contradictions, Lorena. They may be the same truth, told by two very different mouths." She did not know what to feel. Hope was a dangerous thing for a woman who had been disappointed as many times as she had, but something in his certainty, in the careful reverence with which he looked at the mark on her skin, made it difficult to dismiss entirely. That evening, Mabel requested to examine her, this time with greater thoroughness than the first night's brief inspection. The healer drew a small vial of blood, frowning at its color in a way that made Lorena's stomach tighten with old, familiar dread. "This is not natural," Mabel murmured, almost to herself. "There is something in your blood that should not be there, a residue, old, but present." "What does that mean?" Lorena asked. "It means," Mabel said carefully, "that I do not believe you were ever barren, child. I believe someone made you that way, and I believe they have been doing it for a very long time." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every memory Lorena had carried since childhood. The bitter tonics, the healers who never explained their methods, the cycles that never came on schedule, the years of being told her body had simply failed to do what bodies were meant to do. It had never failed. It had been silenced. "Who would do this?" she whispered. "Who would want to do this to me?" Mabel's expression turned grave. "That, Your Grace, is the question we must answer before anyone else discovers what you truly are." Lucien did not sleep that night. Mabel's findings had unsettled him in a way few things could, because a poison administered for years required patience, access, and a reason strong enough to risk discovery. Whoever had silenced Lorena's wolf had not done so out of cruelty alone. They had done so out of fear. He summoned his most trusted advisor, a sharp-tongued shifter named Heir to his study before dawn. "Someone has been suppressing a woman's wolf for over a decade," he told her, pacing before the fire. "It requires moonroot, rare, expensive, and nearly impossible to obtain without contacts inside a temple." Heir's eyebrows rose. "You are speaking of the High Priestess." "I am speaking of whoever benefits from the prophecy never coming true," Lucien said. "Miranda has opposed the old prophecy for years. She has called it superstition in public and feared it in private. If the White Luna never wakes, the temple keeps its influence over every kingdom that fears the wolf curse. You believe Miranda poisoned a noble daughter she had never met, in a kingdom she does not rule, simply to protect her own power. I believe," Lucien said, "that fear makes people reach further than they should. I intend to find proof before I accuse a woman who answers to gods I do not control." Meanwhile, Lorena found herself drawn again and again to the castle gardens, where the cold mountain air seemed to clear the fog that years of shame had left behind her thoughts. It was there that Lucien found her, on the 6th morning, sitting on a stone bench beneath a bare winter tree, her knees drawn up like a girl half her age. "You are troubled," he said, sitting beside her without asking permission, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cold. "I am trying to understand who I am," she admitted. "For 23 years I believed I was empty. Now I am told I was never empty. I was hidden. I do not know how to hold both truths at once." "You do not have to hold them both," Lucien said gently. "You only have to let the second one slowly replace the first." "That is easier said than lived," she murmured. "I know," he said, and something in his voice told her he meant it more deeply than the simple words suggested. "My own bloodline carries a curse that has taken every queen who tried to give it an heir. I have spent years being told I am destined to die without a living child, that no woman who loves me will survive carrying what I give her. I have learned to live inside an unwanted truth as well, Lorena. We are not so different." She studied him then, really studied him, past the crown and the cloak, and the fear his name carried through every kingdom that bordered his own. She saw, instead, a man who had spent his life being feared for a curse he never asked for, the same way she had spent her life, being shamed for a barrenness she never caused. "Why did you really buy me?" she asked softly. "The prophecy explains why you noticed the mark. It does not explain why your hands shook the night the gold left your steward's purse." Lucien was quiet for a long moment, watching the wind move through the bare branches above them. "Because the moment I saw you standing in that hall, dressed like property and sold like grain, something in me that has been silent for years finally spoke. It did not ask whether you were a prophecy. It only asked me to make certain no one ever made you feel small again." Lorena felt warmth climb up her throat, unfamiliar and frightening in its intensity. She had spent her whole life being told she was unwanted. She did not know what to do with a man who looked at her as though she had always, somehow, been exactly what he was waiting for. "I flinch when men raise their voices," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the confession. "I have flinched since I was a child. I do not know why I am telling you this." "Then I will lower mine," Lucien said simply, "for as long as you need me to." He did not reach for her. He did not press closer. He simply sat beside her in the cold garden, his voice gentle, his presence steady, and for the first time since the night her family sold her, Lorena Vale did not feel like something being measured for its usefulness. She felt, simply, like a woman being seen. The seasons in the north did not warn before they turned violent. A storm rolled down from the mountains on the 7th night, rattling the castle's old shutters and filling the corridors with the low howl of wind, searching for a way inside. Lorena woke, gasping from a dream she could not fully remember, only that it had involved cold hands, bitter tea, and her stepmother's voice telling her she would never be enough. She rose, shaking, and found her chamber too small to hold the fear that storm and memory had stirred together. She did not expect to find Lucien standing in the corridor outside her door. "I heard you cry out," he said, his expression tight with concern he made no effort to hide. "I did not enter. I only wanted to be near, in case you needed someone close." "You were guarding my door," she said, something in her chest loosening at the realization. "I have been most nights," he admitted. "I did not tell you, because I did not want you to feel watched. I only wanted you to feel safe." She invited him in, not out of recklessness, but out of a need she had never been permitted to feel before, the simple human need to not be alone with her own fear. They sat near the fire as the storm threw itself against the shutters, and somewhere in the hours that followed, conversation turned from careful distance to something far more honest. "I do not know what it feels like to be wanted," Lorena admitted quietly, watching the flames rather than his face. "Not truly, not without conditions attached. My father wanted obedience, My stepmother wanted convenience. Even the men who once considered marrying me wanted heirs they assumed I could never give. I have never simply been wanted for being myself. Lucien was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped to something low and unguarded. Then I will spend my life teaching you what that feels like, Lorena, even if it takes years for you to fully believe it. The fire cracked between them, and the storm outside seemed, briefly, to soften its fury, as though even the sky understood. It was witnessing something delicate. You frighten kingdoms, she said softly, yet you sit here speaking to me, as though I am the one with power in this room. You are, he said simply. I have faced armies without flinching, Lorena, but I find myself entirely undone by the sound of you laughing. On the rare occasions I have managed to coax it out of you. She laughed then, soft and startled, and the sound seemed to settle something in his chest that had been tight for longer than he could remember. In the days that followed, their closeness deepened in small, careful steps. He found reasons to walk beside her through the gardens. She found herself seeking him out at meals instead of avoiding the great hall the way she once avoided her father's table. At a winter gathering of the northern nobles, suspicious eyes followed her every movement, whispering about the barren woman the Alpha King had brought into his court. Lucien took her hand before the first dance began, ignoring the murmurs entirely. They will judge me, Lorena murmured as he guided her into the slow turning steps. They already believe I bring nothing to this court but scandal. Let them whisper, he said, his hand settling at her waist with a steadiness that silenced her trembling. I am not dancing with their opinions tonight. He did not look away from her once during the entire dance, and by its end, the whispers in the hall had quieted, not because the nobles approved, but because they could see, plainly, that the Alpha King's attention had no room left for their disapproval. Later that night, standing on the same balcony where she had first watched him beneath the moon, Lorena allowed herself, for the first time, to lean her head against his shoulder, without flinching, without calculating the cost, without waiting for the cruelty that comfort had always seemed to promise before. I am not afraid of you, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Good, Lucien said, his voice rough with something tender, because I have never wanted anything as much as I want you to feel safe beside me. The 6th night after Lorena's arrival fell beneath a blood moon, a night the wolves of the north regarded as sacred, when the veil between the living world and the old magic of the moon goddess grew thin enough to be touched. Mabel had requested the ceremony be held that evening, insisting that whatever lingered in Lorena's blood would reveal itself most clearly beneath such a moon. The great hall had been transformed, lit by silver candles instead of torches. The nobles gathered in solemn rows along the walls. Lorena stood at the center, dressed in pale silver fabric that caught the candlelight like moonlit water, her hands trembling despite Lucien's steady presence beside her. Whatever happens tonight, he murmured, low enough for only her to hear, you do not face it alone. Mabel approached with a small silver bowl filled with water drawn from the castle's sacred spring, and began the old chant of the moon pulse ritual, words older than any kingdom in the north. The hall fell utterly silent. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. As Mabel's chant reached its final verse, a faint silver light began to gather around Lorena, gentle at first, then bright enough that several nobles gasped and stepped back. Lorena felt warmth spread through her body, unlike anything she had ever experienced. Not painful, but overwhelming, as though something long asleep inside her had finally opened its eyes. And then, through the silence of the hall, a sound emerged that made every wolf present go rigid with recognition. A heartbeat, small, steady, and unmistakably alive, echoing through the chamber as though the room itself had become a drum for something sacred. Mabel's eyes filled with tears as she turned to the gathered court. The moon pulse has spoken, Lorena Vale carries a living heir, the Alpha King's heir. The hall erupted, not into noise, but into a hush, so profound it felt louder than any cheer could have been. Lorena pressed a trembling hand to her own stomach, disbelief and wonder warring across her face. 6 days. It had only been 6 days since her own family declared her empty, beyond saving. And here, beneath a moon that had chosen her, the truth proved otherwise. Lucien did not speak first. He moved, slow and deliberate, and lowered himself onto one knee before her, in front of the entire court, a gesture that startled even his most loyal advisers. "I do not kneel before you as a king claiming property," he said, his voice carrying through the silent hall. "I kneel before you as a man honoring the woman the moon goddess herself has named, worthy of carrying my line forward. You were never barren, Lorena. You were never empty. You were simply waiting for the world to deserve you." Tears slipped down Lorena's face, not from sorrow, but from a grief finally being allowed to leave her body. Grief for every year she had been told she was less than whole. Grief that now had somewhere to go. "Rise," she whispered, her voice breaking. "A king should not kneel. A man in love kneels exactly where his heart tells him to," Lucien answered, rising slowly to take her hands in his. "And mine has been telling me to kneel before you since the night I first saw you standing in your father's hall." The nobles who had whispered about scandal only weeks before now bowed their heads, not out of fear of their king, but out of reverence for what they had just witnessed. Heir Thorn, standing near the back of the hall, allowed herself a rare, unguarded smile. But even as joy swept through the great hall, Mabel's gaze lingered on the shadows near the entrance, where a figure in deep crimson robes had slipped quietly away before the ceremony's conclusion. High Priestess Miranda had seen everything she feared most come true, and fear, in a woman who had spent years protecting her own power, rarely settled quietly. News of the moon pulse spread through the northern kingdoms faster than any messenger could carry it. The way fire spreads through dry grass, the way shame travels slower than triumph ever does. Within a fortnight, a familiar carriage arrived at the gates of Castle Draven, bearing a crest Lorena had not seen since the night she was sold. House Vale had come to claim her. Eldon Vale stepped down first, his face arranged into an expression of careful sorrow that did not reach his eyes. Deborah followed, draped in furs far finer than anything she had worn before her stepdaughter's sale, and Leona trailed behind them both, her earlier satisfaction replaced now with something closer to calculation. "My daughter," Eldon announced to the assembled guards, his voice cracking with a grief that arrived 6 days too late to matter. "We have come to bring her home, where she belongs, among her own blood." Lucien met them in the courtyard, his posture unyielding, every line of him radiating a warning that needed no words. "She belongs wherever she chooses to belong, Lord Vale. You sold that right the moment you accepted gold for her." "She is blood of House Vale," Deborah interjected smoothly, producing a folded document from beneath her cloak. "There are old laws regarding the return of a daughter who later proves valuable to a noble house. We have come to invoke them." "You did not come for a daughter," Lorena said, stepping forward before Lucien could answer on her behalf. Her voice, steady now in a way it had never been inside her father's hall, carried clearly across the courtyard. "You came for an heir you believe you can profit from." The courtyard fell silent. Even the guards seemed to hold their breath. "You sold me as Barren," Lorena continued, each word deliberate, each word a door closing on a version of herself she no longer carried. "You watched healers poison my blood for years and called it medicine. You stood in that hall and let a stranger call me property, and not one of you said a single word to stop it. Do not return now, dressed in grief you do not feel, because the daughter you discarded turned out to be valuable after all." Deborah's composure faltered for the first time. "We are your family. You were my family when I was poor, useless and easy to sell," Lorena said. "You are strangers now that I am valuable. I will not pretend the difference does not matter. Eldon attempted one final appeal, his voice softening into something almost pleading. Lorena, please, whatever has happened between us, you are still my blood. Blood was never the thing missing between us, father, Lorena answered, and for the first time, her voice softened too, not with forgiveness, but with something closer to mourning for a relationship that had never truly existed. Love was missing. You can buy gold back. You cannot buy that. Lucien stepped beside her then, his hand finding hers, not to speak for her, but simply to stand with her while she spoke for herself. You will leave this castle, he said to House Vale, his voice carrying the quiet finality of a king who rarely needed to raise it, and you will not return. Whatever claim you believe the old laws grant you, I will contest in every court in the north before I allow you to lay a single hand on the mother of my heir. Deborah's eyes flicked toward Leona, searching for some final argument, but Leona, for the first time in the story, said nothing at all, perhaps finally understanding what her own silence had cost someone else for years. The Vale carriage departed as it had arrived, slowly, beneath a grey northern sky, and Lorena watched it go, without the satisfaction she had once imagined she would feel. There was no triumph in watching her family leave. There was only relief, and beneath the relief, a quiet grief for the family she had never actually had. "Are you well?" Lucien asked softly, once the carriage had disappeared beyond the gates. "I will be," Lorena answered, and for the first time, she believed it completely. While House Vale retreated, a far greater threat moved quietly through the shadows of the Moon Temple. High Priestess Miranda had spent years suppressing the prophecy of the White Luna, not out of malice toward any single woman, but out of a fear so old it had calcified into something resembling conviction. If the prophecy proved true, the temple's influence over every wolf kingdom in the north would crumble, replaced by a unity the priesthood had never been able to control. Miranda had found Lorena years earlier, during one of House Vale's many desperate requests for healing, and recognized the silver mark beneath the girl's collarbone immediately. She had not acted out of cruelty when she first arranged for the moon root to be administered. She had acted, she told herself, out of necessity. The same necessity that justifies every quiet evil committed by those convinced they are protecting something larger than one woman's life. Now, with the prophecy confirmed beneath a blood moon, necessity had become desperation. On the night of the next lunar eclipse, when the moon's light would be swallowed entirely by shadow, Miranda traveled north under the cover of a storm, accompanied by a handful of temple guards loyal enough to follow her into treason. She intended to undo what the blood moon had begun, through means darker than any tonic she had used before. Lucien had anticipated the attempt, though not its timing. Heir Thorn's contacts within the temple had warned of Miranda's growing desperation days earlier, and the castle had quietly doubled its watch along every approach. The eclipse descended over Castle Draven in unnatural silence, the kind of silence that precedes violence rather than peace. Miranda's guards struck first, setting fire to the outer watchtower as a distraction, drawing half the castle's defenders away from the inner courtyard where Lorena slept. Lucien fought at the gates himself, his wolf form a blur of silver and shadow against the burning sky, while inside the castle, Mabel woke Lorena with urgent hands. "She has come for the child," Mabel said, helping Lorena to her feet. "We must move you to the sanctuary chamber." But Miranda had anticipated the sanctuary as well. She met them in the corridor, robes singed at the edges from the fire she had set, her eyes wild with the particular madness of a woman who has convinced herself that destruction is the same thing as salvation. "You should never have woken," Miranda hissed at Lorena. "The prophecy was meant to stay buried with you." "You poisoned me for years," Lorena said, standing her ground, despite the fear coursing through her, "because you were afraid of what I might become. I am no longer the frightened girl you silenced in her father's house, priestess." Miranda raised a blade humming with old, corrupted magic, intending to sever the prophecy at its source. But before she could strike, Lorena felt something inside her finally break free entirely. The wolf that had been silenced since childhood rose at last, not gently, but with the full ferocity of years stolen from her, and Lorena shifted for the first time in her life into a wolf, as white and pure as untouched snow. The transformation halted Miranda mid-strike, disbelief overtaking madness for one crucial moment, a moment Lucien arrived, just in time to use. He struck the blade from her hand before she could recover, his own wolf form towering and merciless, though he stopped short of killing her, restraint even now governing his fury. "It is finished, Miranda," he said, his voice a low growl beneath his human words. "The prophecy you feared has already come true. You did not stop it. You only delayed it. And in delaying it, you have lost everything you tried to protect." Temple guards loyal to Lucien's allies arrived moments later, taking Miranda into custody as the fire at the watchtower was finally extinguished. Lorena, shifted back into human form, sank to her knees in the corridor, exhausted beyond words, but alive, and beside her, still curled protectively close, her child remained safe. In the weeks that followed the eclipse, word of Miranda's exposure spread through every wolf kingdom in the north, carried by nobles who had once whispered about a barren woman sold for gold, and now spoke instead of the White Luna, who had survived a high priestess's curse and shifted into a wolf, as pure as winter itself. House Vale's name, once merely declining, became a cautionary tale, told in noble houses across the kingdom, a warning about the cost of mistaking a daughter's silence for her absence of worth. Eldon's remaining allies distanced themselves quietly. Deborah's social invitations dwindled to nothing. Leona, alone among them, sent a single letter to Castle Draven, brief and unadorned, containing only the words, "I am sorry," and Lorena read it twice before setting it aside, unanswered, not out of cruelty, but because some apologies require more time to mean something than 6 words can hold. Lorena's own transformation continued in ways beyond the physical. She no longer flinched at raised voices in the castle, because she had learned, slowly, that not every loud sound preceded harm. She no longer measured her worth by what her body could produce, because she had learned that her value had never actually depended on it, even when everyone around her insisted otherwise. "You are different," Lucien observed one evening, watching her move through the garden with a confidence that had not existed in her the night she first arrived. "I am the same woman," Lorena said, smiling faintly. "I simply stopped believing the lies told about her." Their bond, tested by danger and tempered by honesty, deepened into something neither of them had words large enough to describe. Lucien remained fiercely protective, a habit born from genuine fear rather than possession. But Lorena, true to the strength the blood moon had revealed in her, refused to let protection become a cage. "You watch me as though I might break," she told him one night, only half teasing. "I survived poison I did not know I was drinking. I survived a priestess's blade. I think I can survive a walk to the village without an armed escort, Lucien." He laughed, low and warm, a sound that had become rarer and richer the longer she stayed beside him. "You are right. I am learning the difference between protecting you and trusting you, Lorena. It is a difficult lesson for a man who spent years protecting a kingdom that never trusted him back." "Then we will learn it together," she said, "the same way we have learned everything else." As the months passed and her body changed with the growing life inside her, the kingdom that had once distrusted a barren bride from a declining house came instead to revere her, not because of the heir she carried, but because of the woman she had proven herself to be in carrying it. Nobles who had once avoided her company now sought her counsel. Servants who had once watched her with careful pity now watched her with open admiration. Mabel, ever practical even amid wonder, remained the one person who refused to let reverence become excess. "Your Majesty," she told Lucien dryly, finding him hovering anxiously outside Lorena's chamber for the third time in a single evening. Unless your royal glare possesses some healing property I am unaware of, I suggest you move, before I am forced to test whether kings bruise the same as anyone else. Even Lorena, resting nearby, laughed at that. A full, unguarded laugh that filled the chamber with a warmth no fire could match. On the night the next full moon rose, clear and silver over Castle Draven, the northern kingdoms gathered in numbers the castle had not seen in a generation. Word of the trial against High Priestess Miranda had concluded weeks earlier, her influence stripped, her crimes laid bare before every temple in the north, and the wolf kingdoms that had once feared the old prophecy now gathered instead to witness its fulfillment. Lorena stood at the top of the castle steps, in robes of pale silver and deep midnight blue, the silver mark beneath her collarbone now worn openly rather than hidden, a symbol rather than a shame. Beside her stood Lucien, his crown catching the moonlight, his eyes holding only her. "Do you remember?" he asked quietly, as the court gathered below them. "The first night you arrived here, you stood at the bottom of these steps, certain I intended to use you the way your family had always used you." "I remember," Lorena said. "I remember thinking I had nothing left for anyone to take." "And now?" he asked. "Now I know I had everything left to give," she said. "I simply needed someone willing to look past what my family decided I was worth." Mabel stepped forward to begin the coronation rites, her voice steady, despite the tears gathering in her eyes. Tears, she would later insist, with characteristic dryness, were simply a reaction to the cold mountain air. The crowd below fell silent as Lucien lifted a circlet of moonstone and silver, the same metal that had marked Lorena's skin since birth, and placed it gently upon her head. "Rise, Lorena Draven," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with a tenderness his subjects had rarely heard in their king. "Luna, queen of the northern wolves, mother of the heir who will unite what fear has divided for generations." The crowd's response was not the thunderous cheer of conquest, but something gentler and more lasting, a collective exhale of relief from kingdoms that had spent generations fearing a curse, now finally broken by love rather than war. Lorena looked out over the gathered crowd, the same kind of nobles who would once have called her Barren without a second thought, now bowing their heads before her, and she felt no bitterness rise in her chest, only a quiet, settled peace. She had imagined, in darker moments during her journey north, that justice might feel like revenge. It did not. It felt like simply, finally, being seen for who she had always been, beneath the lies others told about her. That night, after the court had retired, and the castle settled into its rare hours of true quiet, Lucien found her once more on the same balcony where their story had truly begun, watching the same moon that had once condemned her now crown her instead. "You once told me you did not know what it felt like to be wanted," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I remember," she said softly. "Do you know now?" he asked. Lorena turned to him, the moonlight silver against her face, the weight of a crown new and unfamiliar upon her brow, and the weight of a love far older than either of them had first understood, settled warm and certain in her chest. "I am beginning to," she said, "and I intend to spend the rest of my life learning the rest of it, beside you." Lucien drew her gently against him, and beneath the same full moon that had once revealed her deepest truth, the king once feared by every kingdom in the north, and the woman once discarded by her own family, stood together, no longer separated by gold, by lies, or by the cruelty of those who had mistaken her silence for emptiness. She had been sold as Barren. She had risen as a queen, and the heir, growing beneath her heart, would one day inherit a kingdom built not on fear, but on the simple, hard-won truth that even the most discarded among us may carry within them a power the world has not yet learned to recognize. Thank you for staying until the very end of Lorena and Lucien's story. If this tale of betrayal, destiny, and hard-won love moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories like it. Tell us in the comments which kingdom you would have chosen, House Vale or Castle Draven, and where in the world you are watching from tonight. We read every single comment, and if we could reach through this screen and hand each of you a warm blanket and a cup of tea, we would. Until the next story, stay warm, stay hopeful, and never let anyone convince you that you are less than what you truly carry inside.